Hello and welcome to the Fuban Forum. I'm Michael Rock, here from New York City, and I'm here with Shaway Yeh from Shanghai. For those of you who don't know her, Shaway is one of the most influential figures in the fashion world, a product of Taipei. She studied in New York and went on to become the fashion director of GQ Taiwan. She moved on to Shanghai to work on the launch of Vogue China and to advise a number of fashion houses on their Asian activities. From there, she went on to Modern Weekly and then was elevated to the editorial director of the publishing conglomerate Modern Media. And alongside all of those professional jobs, she's always managed to write and speak and organize exhibitions. And in so doing, she's been kind of instrumental in contributing to the fashion discourse in China. But first, I want to revert to the question, of the night, and I'm really looking around these two questions. And the first one really is about what happened, and what I mean by that is what happened from when you first started and you first sort of entered into the fashion industry and became like the ultimate fashion insider to the way that you're looking at work now. And how do you see that evolution in yourself, and how is that like representative of a bigger evolution in fashion? And if you're one of its most perceptive critics, what does it mean that you've changed your focus from the business and the form and the variation of fashion to this other subject? So let's still talk a little bit about how you got here in the first place, and where you find yourself now.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone at the Fuban Forums. But okay, let's go back to the very beginning. You say I've been skeptical or critical, and I think that has a lot to do with, I think about that as being coming from Taiwan. I mean, I'm very proud of my upbringing. I think it's a lovely place, but somehow it's on the fringe of the global map in many circumstances. So being on the fringe gives you this kind of alternative insight. You don't feel like you belong to anywhere. You're questioning who write the rules and why should I obey the rules? And then, yeah. So I think that's kind of always inside my characters. So even when I'm in fashion industry or whatever, so I was actually also never choose to be inside the fashion industry. It's a series of curation. It happened to be end up there. I do remember when I was 23rd, I was at a friend's house, and the first time I saw like Italian Vogue. And because before you always see Vogue at the supermarket, you say like, what is something for housewife? Like I will never look at that. But until I saw a copy of Italian Vogue at a friend's house, I realized, wow, it's actually could be really beautiful and really artistic. So maybe there is something about fashion. And also I think like every young people, when you're in the first in unknown places, it's easier to choose fashion to express yourself, to kind of construct your own personality. And then also during that time when you're doing the independent magazine world, although it's a mix of culture, design, art, whatever, but somehow I think fashion among all the cultural industries always has much stronger commercial side. So you become your advertiser. So you become an industry you'll eventually go into. So thus I went back to Taiwan when they first set up a Condé Nast in Taiwan in 1996 of Vogue and GQ. So, but I was only there briefly. Then I went to Hong Kong to work on a fashion TV station. Fashion for me is never really fashion. So it's always part of a greater creative expressions. And then,
as a kind of cultural signifier, as a way to understand the culture through fashion.
Yeah, I think so. So that's why, so that kind of also formed my approach when I finally had the opportunity to act in Modern Weekly. And then, well, it wasn't as influential to begin with. It was interesting, it's different because compared to the most Chinese magazine at that time, it's more commercial because the founder is from the South. So it looks more like any other consumer magazines. But then again, I think at the time in the media landscape or fashion landscape in China, it's quite free and it's kind of like empty. So again, it's the thing is like, you're free to create what you want, because what is unique about modern media is unlike its competitor, either it's Condé Nast or a state-owned media company, it's started by an independent entrepreneur. So it doesn't need to follow this is a Vogue guideline, or this is like a New York Times, whatever, or this is later on the company do work with Bloomberg, so there's like a Bloomberg way. So there's really no modern media way. So whoever is working on it is making our own rules and then freely choose whatever we want to say.
Do you think that Chinese design, when you say, you know, becoming on par with Western design, can it develop its own syntax, its own way of creating, approaching fashion, which is really distinctly different from the Western approach?
Well, I think yes, but I would say it will, because like, well, what I'm saying, like, okay, 10 years ago, it started merging. So basically those are students who went to St. Martin or Parsons, okay? They might not even be the best students. And the second wave is like 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, they're like after history of Chinese students going to fashion school. So finally you have someone who are better, and they have better educations, and they participate more international competitions or this and that. So the work got stronger, and then they are also aware they being focused as a Chinese designers. They are trying very hard to find their own aesthetics or standards. Well, not standard, aesthetic or vocabulary. So few of them are doing quite well, because the thing is you need to balance your so-called Chinese aesthetic or a so-called Oriental vocabulary with still there's a design. There's like what's going on in the design world right now. So how do you combine the both sensibilities? So I think there's few designers who are doing kind of well, but still it's kind of like more in the conceptual way, like how do I cop out a Chinese aesthetic? But now I see the possibility of the third wave, which is just beginning, which because the whole pandemic, because sadly our world has become more segregated. And then that in a way give this Chinese designer a good opportunity to focus on the Chinese market itself. So I can see they're paying more attention about what Chinese consumer, what's going on in China, what do they like? They have a different way of doing business. So I think they will form another more, that's conceptual, but more realistic Chinese way of dressing, or I don't know, style or aesthetics. But this is, I think it just started from this year. So I don't know where does it goes, but I feel like, yeah, something like that will happen.
We'll come back to that later when we talk about the what's next part. So, but so tell me a little bit about Copenhagen and how, and do you see that also as the kind of turning point where you started to think differently about the industry you'd been sort of part of and covering for so long?
Well, Copenhagen Fashion Summit has been around 10. This year actually is the 11th year. So established by this woman called Eva Cruz in Denmark. I think it was started from the year the COP19 or whatever was in Denmark. So she reflect upon like the fashion industry's impact on climate change and all these things. So she started this. So at the very beginning, it's kind of niche because only very few people and most like European people attended to. And then when I was invited, it was like 5 years ago. So it's basically the annual gathering of industry leaders, including like top CEOs from the company who has been focused on sustainability, like Caring Groups or Nike's or H&M or CNA, etc. And then and top NGOs and few enlightened designers or a lot of people working still at that time. There's this kind of called sustainable fashion sector and a lot of like manufacturer and supply chain people. So they are gathering together to talk about the issues of environmental impact and social impact of our fashion industry. So the year I went, it was the first time they have like editors from like other than European peoples. And then it was kind of shocked me because after reporting and writing and whatever, and believing myself bringing so many diverse voices of fashion industry, but I never know about its environmental and social impact. For me, like this is like not possible, like being someone who's quote unquote so important in the fashion industry and not being aware about that. And then so I feel quite ashamed, but also quite enlightened. And then also kind of going back to another two things happening in the background is like, oh, I think that's also the time, like when a lot of people working in the fashion or in the media business is feeling like there's the urge to transform or to do something else because the whole traditional fashion media or even the way fashion business is going, it's all kind of hit into a like I don't know, like a dead end. So what's next? Like, what should you write about? What do you care about? Like, how can you lead the industry to go forward? Because no one is happy about the status quo, but what's next? So this kind of give me a window. And also it has also going back to my part of the upbringing in Taiwan, because during my times in Taiwan, that's the time when social movement and student movements is all going. So that's kind of my formation year. So we always caring about social issues, whatever, but just for a long time within the fashion industry, it's kind of hard to grow that kind of voice out because no one cares. Everyone only care about creativity and commerce, right? So I think it's like a combination of all the things made me feel like this is a direction I should go into. So I want to pay more attention to understand the issues more, and I still have Modern Weekly as a tour. So I starting like wiki columns, having my editor research on it and participate more on this forum. And then, so after 1 year or 2 years, and then it's actually the whole issue about sustainability is getting more and more momentum.
Is it an essentially different kind of question as it pertains to fashion than as it pertains to any other business? Like, is there something specific about fashion as it relates to sustainability that's different than, say, car design and sustainability or something?
Yeah, well, yes and no, because also I think like from different approaches, like I think for a long time, maybe because like it also goes with your age and also how fashion media and how we talk about fashions, construct about fashion change. I think at the very beginning, most people focus on creativity. So we have all the star designer, McQueen, Galliano, Hamilton, Margiela, all this. So we focus on their creativity. How do they use the idea to disrupt fashion, and how to, and then more and more, I think in the 20s, like more and more people focus on the business of fashion. That's why BOF is kind of, and WLD is kind of important, because people realize actually it's not about like individual creativity. So about how companies or conglomerate, like using their financial gains, using their business strategies, and trying to create more and more commodity to selling to people, and then employ people like us to express the messages. So it's actually part of a business strategy. So I think, but then I think now it's moving on, like then after that people want to know more. So then behind all this creativity and this business structure, there's actually a value chain, or people used to call it supply chain, but I prefer to call it value chain. So there's factories, there's workers, there are transportations, there are logistics, and even now people going even further back in the sustainability, people start talking about regenerative agriculture because things actually coming from the earth. So in that way, and then it's also another enlightenment for me is like, so in this case, you're not only talking about certain individuals' creativity or few capitalists' manipulation, but you are actually talking about the whole earth systems. Like whatever you wear could come from something which was underground and be formulated by the sunlight or photosynthesis like billions a year ago, and it be transformed through all this process, and it end up to be a fiber on your clothes. So I think, well, what can be a much more beautiful and poetic way to understand fashion? So by understanding back more and more about the system behind. So
So how does that lead to the work of your consultancy and sort of what you focus on now and what you do? Because that's a pretty big change from what you were doing before, right?
So what I do right now, so I started this consultancy agency. Is like, well, it just, because I don't know how to call it. It can be me or it can be a small company. But what I do still is two components. So one is still communication. It just, I stopped using a set magazine as a tool of communication. So that's why I like to do forums. I like to organize talk or sometimes exhibitions or occasional writing. So it's still like communicating idea about what is sustainability. And then from the common topic, it's like, what is ocean plastic? How do you avoid ocean plastic? What are the better material there? To this, hopefully I can still forming my thinking system and come much better. Well, it's like this way of going back to the earth, going back to the energy. So this is all part of a communication. But the other one is like, when you feel like you need to have a real impact, you need to work with the stakeholders, right? So most people were thinking I'm doing consumer education since I'm coming from the media background. But for me, especially in China, I think it's not difficult to do consumer educations because people are very open to embrace new things. And then the whole like social media communication is quite widespread. So when you decided to spread some new idea, it's actually and change people's mindset. It's actually not very difficult, but it's a very simple question is, how about if I convince everybody you need to buy sustainable fashion and whatever, but where are they? It's almost not in the market. So I think it's actually more important to help like the industries or brands or companies to go on much more sustainable sourcing and production and design and so forth and so forth. So that's why I choose to study corporate sustainability and also working with few companies to help them to understanding what is sustainability, to set up the strategies, to identify the area which they can work on. And then the good things about China is if a company decide to do something, they will jump on it too quite quickly. So even just within 2-3 years, some company already has a whole new product line. It's on the markets already. So from they're just trying to set up a strategy, implementing some process, doing some research to the final product line is coming on the market. So
thank you for taking us through that that trajectory, because I think that there really is this very marked change in the way that you're looking at this subject, and that you start off looking at it one way and then shift and almost looking at it from the other side ultimately by the end of that period. So now we're in the really particular time, as you said, that there's a kind of forced isolation. The market's been isolated to a certain extent. That elevates designers in a way, local designers in a way. But what do you see happening after this? Like what are the next big things that we should be thinking about, and where do you think the industry goes from here?
Honestly, I actually don't know, because I guess no one can say they know what's the next. I mean, you can say what you hope for and what you see is kind of happening, because so the only thing I can say is, well, in terms of fashion industry, I think it got hit a lot because I think, well, from like more boring on the book thing, like the supply chains got cut off in a lot of places. So companies need to rethink about their supply chain, like where do they manufacture, where do they produce things, where do they sell? So they need to localize and to have much more agile supply chain. So in a way that might help to boost the local economies and have something much more like flexible. And then, but the scary things about that is maybe that will encourage you to produce even more. And then, so another thing is, of course, like except China, no one else is shopping, right? So,
yeah, shopping stopped in New York.
Exactly, except China, no one is shopping. So I was just funny. Yesterday, I just heard because it's going to be Shanghai Fashion Week in 3 weeks. So there's actually quite a few companies and the CEO who are flying here voluntarily to quarantine for 14 days in order to participate in the Shanghai Fashion Week. And people say, wow, I cannot believe the so-and-so CEO do that. I said, why not? Because this is the only place it's selling in the whole world right now.
Right,
so they can sacrifice 14 days to come here. So I think the world become kind of, I wouldn't say it's imbalanced, but it's totally different kind of balance, or different kind of disbalance or disturbance, looking for a new balance. And then but then also, I think, I don't really know exactly the impact for most other component stakeholder in the fashion industry, but in China, it looks kind of it's okay. And then, but there's a lot of hope, I think, at the very beginning of this pandemic and crisis. I'm hoping, like people are hoping this will change people think about how to produce, how to live, what is more important, and how do we do things, how do we do business. But I don't really know is it really going to be better, because like we're hoping people will produce less, selling less, and doing better. But then it seems like the business want to go back to normal. They think, especially those Chinese companies, now they want to do more in recover the losses.
Do you imagine that we're going to go back to, all the journalists in the world going from Milan to Paris to New York and back again, and that whole cycle is going to just start up again, or you think that's fundamentally changed?
I think it probably will go back. Yeah, because it's funny enough, most fashion industry people are talking about is like the canceling of Fashion Week, as if that's the most important thing. It's certainly not the most important thing, but then I realized why people keep talking about it, because it's kind of like the ritual among this industry. Actually, each industry has a ritual. People want to get together, to exchange, to feel you're part of the industry. Even though the whole impact of the Fashion Week compared to billions of people losing jobs, the store closing down, and this and that, it's really not a big deal, like fashion editor got to travel or not. But then it dawned on me why it's so important to people. It's much more in an emotional and psychological value, because without that, you don't feel like I belong to this industry. I don't know what's going on. And then everything is happening on the clouds. So I am sure when the travel ban is lifted, hopefully sometime next year, people will still want to do it. And then you just, I think the only difference will be some player die and then you can have some new players. I feel like the whole pandemic, the crisis is not a temporary thing. It's also not like we'll go back to the normal, or it will be something totally. I feel like we're at the beginning of a totally new things, which we still don't know quite what. Like for me personally, I'm struggling to use all these digital tools, because I'm going to do my forum the first time all online, but how to do an online forum, which is not boring, how to do this, whatever, even though everything can happen offline here. But I think there's a lot of new way of thinking and communicating and receiving live or whatever is being introduced to us now because of pandemic. So I will need a lot of time to learn how to do this, because I don't think it will replace the way we were before, but it definitely will be part of our new reality. So how to make the best of this new reality is I'm trying to thinking, but I'm also hoping like things will go slower. So remember at the beginning of the year, I bought like so many books. I think this year I'm going to do nothing, just reading. But I stopped at the book. I only finished 3.5 and it stopped there since April, because we start getting busy in May here. And so.
Well, I think start making sense of our new reality is probably a good place to begin anyways for our next decade. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to see you again. Take care.
Me too. Bye.